The story about Jesus told in the play The Galilean helps people see the remarkableness of Jesus in a dramatic new light. In this story, the image of Jesus is very much different than the popular image that emphasizes only the divinity of Jesus and his act of dying as a sacrifice for sins. In the play, there is an image that helps us see the humanity of Jesus and the historical nature of his message and ministry. The glimpse of the historical Jesus comes from the illumination provided by the historical critical academic studies of historical Jesus scholars that has been a part of a major new quest in the past 20 years. This story in the Galilean begins by showing Jesus discovering his different message while working in the apocalyptic ministry of John the Baptist. From this ministry that's centered on cleansing through baptism and awaiting for divine intervention, Jesus started his own ministry of telling a new story with a message that the kingdom of God was already at hand. Now, people understood living in the kingdom under the rule of Rome, but Jesus asked if they could understand living if God was reigning the kingdom. But first there had to be a new message about God for the people. Jesus realized that his culture was living with the concept that God was unapproachable and unavailable. Only the chief high priest was allowed into the presence of God, and then only one day of the year, on the Day of Atonement, he would enter the Holy of Holies. Jesus had a new truth, a very different view of God. It was a simple truth of the enormity of God's love and of the radical availability and accessibility of God's presence, God's Spirit, and God's transforming love. Jesus lived in a culture where social injustice was rampant. More than 2/3 of the population was on the brink of becoming destitute. And the religious purity laws clearly defined barriers for those who were outside the favor of God. There was a clear message of exclusion for those who were viewed by society as people who are experiencing the wrath of God. Jesus saw the poor and the ill, the diseased, and the masses of people on the threshold of being forced behind the barriers. And he knew it was time for change. It was a time for a revelation of a new truth, the truth about God's love and care for all people. The Galilean shows Jesus starting his ministry among those who have been outcast. You can hear his message that tells of a new perspective, of the reach of God's love and the availability and the accessibility of God's favor and presence. And you can see the people begin to hear. Transformation begins to happen. The Galilean tells the story of Jesus' message, his ministry, and his mission to make God real for all. He laid out a journey of faith that involved allowing relationship to happen. Human and divine could be interacting without the brokerage of an individual or an institution. Sins were forgiven because God's love was stronger and more capable than religion had previously understood. People who had been forced to live without any hope of God's favor in their lives, who had lived under the condemnation and punishment of God, were suddenly being let into the palace. They were being told access was their right. All they had to do was hear the truth that Jesus spoke and believe it, to open their minds and hearts and let God's Spirit and love and presence transform their lives. And they did. It happened. Jesus' words had impact. His message was received. The reality of God and of God's love and presence in their lives changed everything. Now, the message that Jesus aggressively carried to his own culture was not meant to be a destructive challenge to the religion of his day, but was intended to be a revitalization of that faith. Its purpose was to tear down the many barriers that were keeping people out, but by implications of its truths. It became a direct challenge to the brokerage authority of the temple, the priests, and the traditions that had been in place for so long. Imagine the position into which that put the religious leaders of the day. The very truths that they were sure were given by God were being questioned, and an alternative truth, a new paradigm, was being put forth. Jesus just had to be wrong. Then suddenly, he was arrested. And a rush to judgment landed him on a cross within hours and killed him so quickly that hardly more than half a day passed from his last night with his disciples. All of this must have produced a shock that we can't even begin to fathom. His disciples had been swept along on a journey of ministry that had extended for many months across the countryside. They had felt the euphoria of being included in a movement so obviously close to God and filled with God's powerful presence. Now, suddenly, things are drastically changed, and in an incredibly traumatic fashion. All the foundations and the moorings that have provided security are instantly vanished. How devastating that must have been. Such a sudden sense of feeling powerless and naked in a real world out of control shakes violently every inner fiber of your soul and makes you question everything you have ever thought to be truth. Jesus had said relationship with God was a reality.